The archive grows. Like, comment, subscribe, feed it.
Many of you have probably already heard the rumors going around town about underground tunnels in the old part of Snezhinsk. We set out to learn more, and with the help of one of Oaknell's readers, we managed to track down someone with the information we were after. The first conversation with this person, held over the phone, was difficult, and unfortunately, it ended without much result. But 2 days later, he showed up at the editorial office on his own and, much to our surprise, agreed to tell us everything. His nearly 4-hour account hit like a bombshell. Everyone who heard it, and especially the person who later had to transcribe the recording, which, of course, turned out to be frustratingly poor quality, spent the next week walking around with red, sleepless eyes. Opinions varied wildly, but there was one thing we all agreed on. This is sensational. After some understandable hesitation, we decided to publish the story more or less exactly as we heard it. The minor edits made were only for clarity, based on the speaker's phrasing and the recording quality. We also left out a number of rather unfair remarks about specific city officials and leadership of RFNC VNI ITF, Russian Federal Nuclear Center, All Russian Research Institute of Technical Physics. We're taking up the challenge made by the author, who said the editorial team would be too scared to publish his revelations. But Oaknell is an independent outlet, and we see no reason to hold back material like this. That said, we're fully aware that after the second or third installment, the story is slated to run in at least 10 parts. We'll probably be getting confused, if not angry phone calls. So let us make it clear right now. We're publishing this piece as a work of literary fiction, and we take no responsibility for the truthfulness of the events described. The author's full name and contact information are on file, but for several reasons, we're choosing not to make them public for now. And one more thing. To our respected visitor, it's been about a month since we've heard from you. Please stop by or give us a call, if only so we can make sure you're all right. I don't give a damn whether you believe me or not. If you don't, I'll just get up and leave. You mean no more to me than this empty beer can right here. I didn't go looking for you. You were the ones digging around, asking questions to my old acquaintances. And yeah, I know, they all call me a nutcase. Fine. I've come to realize people like to hide from life under the armor of their so-called common sense. Fine. It's easier that way. More comfortable. But the real lunatic, the biggest dumbass, is the one who seriously believes that the greatest secret in Snezhinsk is just our pathetic atomic bombs. You'd have to be completely brainless to think this entire defense system was built just to protect a few half-assed design secrets. Though, okay, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm just pissed off. Just can't get over the fact that hardly anyone knows the truth. But I do. Let's set the terms right away. I'm going to tell you only what I saw with my own eyes. You listen to the very end, and I won't tolerate any dumb questions. I'll speak the way I want, not the way you'd like. You want me to start with, and then I saw, well, forget it. If I just stumbled into something by accident, then sure, it would make for a neat little Indiana Jones story. A thriller, an adventure flick. But that's not what this is. I worked toward this. Got it? I worked for it for nearly 30 years of my life. I found the means. I found the goal. And eventually realized that the very means I had was perfect for that goal. So, you will listen. Every word, or just assume I wandered in here by mistake. I'm not interested in your reaction or what you'll do with this story. I'm not scared of anyone or anything. I already had my run-ins with a shrink, and that was enough to figure out how this whole thing ends, right down to the last nail in the box. But again, I'm not afraid. You'll be the first to chicken out when it comes to printing what I have to say. I was born in Snezhinsk. Back then, of course, it was just 70th, or more accurately 50th, right after Gagarin's launch. My mom gave birth to me during that whole wave of universal optimism, happiness, and pride. Even my name comes from that time. We lived with my sister and parents on Sverdlova Street in Building 42, the one diagonal from the high-rise by Malachite, just across the boulevard. Back then, that god-awful 9-story eyesore didn't exist. Instead, there was a beautiful hill with towering pine trees, so tall they looked like ship masts. I remember once telling my mom, puffed up with cleverness, "Mom, I know why wind happens. It's because the trees move." My childhood was just like any other. Fistfights in the yard with horseboy Yasha. Uncle Zhora threatening to yank my ears when I bothered the grown-ups playing billiards. Riding my bike along the boulevard under the watchful eyes of my parents. Our windows faced the street. I remember the other kids, Leshka Simonov, the Kiryanin brothers, the Buzdi Garovs, who later moved to Minsk, and plenty of others. Let me tell you about the first really powerful experience I had. One that I believe shaped my entire path afterwards. At the time, next to my beloved hill where I spent all my free time, they started building the now famous Malachite restaurant. When they were putting up the shell of the building, I must have been 7 or 8, it became a whole thing in our neighborhood. The challenge was to sneak onto the construction site without getting caught by the watchman, jump through a narrow window into the basement darkness, and climb out the other side using a wooden plank. Just another backyard rite of passage. Of course, I was among the first. After doing it a few times and getting comfortable in the not-so-scary basement, I decided to explore further, crawled through an opening, and found myself in front of something magical. Rising straight up from the ground were these fantastical formations. It took me a second to find the right word, but I got there. Stalagmites. They glowed faintly from within, an eerie green light. And when I touched them, I realized they were made of ice. And this was the middle of summer. I stood there for several minutes, totally entranced by this hidden beauty. And that sense of secret wonder has never left me. To this day, I don't know what that was. Maybe the construction had accidentally opened a natural cavity underground, or maybe it was some bizarre man-made effect. But the fact remains, I realized that underground, there's something else. Something that people who live above ground will never experience. From that moment on, I never missed a single construction site in the city. I knew every brick and every rock at the Salnekny grocery store site, School 127, the first Yubileyny Cultural Center, which used to be called Sinagry, until a pompous anniversary killed its lovely name. Wake me up in the middle of the night and I can recite the layout of every foundation pit being dug along Pobedy Street. I can list the rock layers they had to dig through. I was into mineralogy back then, read a lot of Fersman, and I could describe the trenches for utilities running from one pit to the next. My explorations weren't all sunshine and rainbows. I got caught more than once, usually by some concerned neighbor type. They give me long-winded lectures about how good boys don't hang around construction sites where heavy cranes might fall on their heads. I hated that coddling crap from the beginning. I quickly realized they just wanted to feel important. They didn't give a damn about my safety. So I made a point of avoiding such people when I could. Looking back now, I think that was a pretty rational conclusion for an 8-year-old. Once, some guy caught me at the 6th building on Pobedy Street. He latched onto my shoulder like a leech and dragged me to the police station, which was then in a 2-story building behind the Asna store. Since he didn't have any real reason to report me, he complained that I called the police cops. Didn't say a word about the construction site. That was my first real interaction with the law, and it was a major letdown. A full hour talking to a grown man in uniform, and all I got was the same line over and over. Who taught you to call the police that? All I took from that was any adult with power. And back then, all adults seemed powerful, is better avoided. Time proved me right. Like I said, the knowledge didn't come without pain, both mental and physical. One time, I rode my bike to the construction site of Building 40 on Lennon Street, the third long building from the music school, and didn't see a trench they dug the day before for a heating pipe. I dropped 2 meters straight into it, bike and all. I'm still amazed I survived. Smashed my forehead on a protruding stone, and the bike folded like a cheap chair. Took forever to convince my dad the damage came from crashing into a curb by the Ilotchka store. Another time, during reconstruction at Gagarin Stadium, they tore down the old wooden stands and dug a pit for the new ones. Summer rains filled it almost 2 meters deep with water. Of course, some dumb playground dare made me lash together 2 planks from the fence and try sailing across. I still remember the sensation of slipping under, coming up for air less and less, and that wide-eyed man nearby tearing off his pants and diving in after me in nothing but his boxers. I owe him my life, and I've always wanted to find him and say thank you. I never got the chance. All that was just the lyrical part. But you need the lyric to understand my restless soul, to get why I felt such a fierce pull downward into the depths, to realize that obstacles never dull my hunger for the unknown. And to understand, finally, why one evening I stood at another construction trench and quietly said to myself, Yora, this must lead somewhere. One day, walking along a freshly dug trench near Building 52 on Lennon Street, I was surprised to find that the pipes, the same ones the welders had been fussing over for 2 days, didn't simply vanish into the sand like I had expected. No, they ran neatly into a concrete channel, like a corridor, inviting me to step in and follow them into the unknown. That day, I didn't get far. No, I wasn't scared. I've never really feared the unknown. I suppose I'd been conditioned early on to believe that the world was made for man, that it held no real threat. But it was dark, that's all, pitch black. And in that darkness, I realized 2 things. I needed a flashlight, and I needed to learn how to navigate unfamiliar places. And then it hit me. I was trying to kick down an open door. The city was full of manholes, inspection shafts, and utility tunnels, each one a gateway into some hidden world. but I couldn't act on that revelation right away. I was just a kid, barely 10, and physically I just couldn't lift one of those heavy cast iron lids. So I began searching for open manholes. To my surprise, there were quite a few. I found them around the utility line that extended Lenina Street. The Three Little Pigs Cafe didn't even exist yet. In the woods beyond the train tracks near what's now the building supply store, and near the garages on what would later be called Novaya Street. Inside the uncovered shafts, welded rebar rungs waited for me, seemingly just for me, and I used them to easily climb down, lighting my path with a flashlight I got for my birthday, exploring the underground maze that opened up before me. To be honest, most of these tunnels ended in dead ends, 10 to 15 meters in, but not all of them were truly impassable. In most cases, the pipes, usually running in pairs, disappeared into narrowing passages stuffed with insulation and similar gunk. At first, that stopped me. But one day, gathering my courage, I climbed up onto the upper pipe. I think it was near the city rescue station, pressed my face into the fiberglass wool, and crawled forward. My bravery paid off. After about 20 meters, I noticed my clothes weren't catching on the rough concrete anymore. I turned on my flashlight. I'd entered a passage just like the one I had come from. I walked another 10 meters, found rungs, climbed up, and bumped my head against the lid. That didn't discourage me, but found a way to travel underground. My adventures were not always pleasant. I remember one time crawling through an open shaft near Building 9 on Vasilyev Street, right across from the old Zarya cafeteria. I stumbled across the half-rotted, reeking corpse of some kind of cat or dog. It didn't shock me. I'd already seen plenty of gross stuff in those tunnels. But after that, I started wearing a respirator mask I begged off some painters who were working on the walls of Building 32 on Pobedy Street. I remember that clearly. I think it was May or June, 1971. Thanks again, ladies. I started classifying my routes as good or bad, though to a surface dweller like you, they'd all probably seem the same. Dark and filthy. But it's like how some people prefer walking from the bookstore to the food co-op along Vasilyev, while others like taking the scenic route through the square, past Luke in the department store. Same with me. I prefer traveling from the shaft near the health clinic to the one behind the greenhouse at School 127. The best spot to climb out in the evenings, not through the collector near Building 11 on Pobedy Street, which stank of sewage even at surface level, but through the clean and tidy service tunnel behind the Yubilini shopping center. When I turned 12, it occurred to me to draw a map of the underground tunnels I explored. I already knew them by heart. I've got a great visual and spatial memory, but I'd been reading a book on labyrinths and became obsessed with mapping things out. Around the same time, after watching some plumbers work, I learned how to open manhole covers. It's not hard. Even a 5th grader can do it once you know where to stick the pry bar and how to lift the lid. I could open any lid in 5 seconds. Another 5 seconds was all I needed to slip inside and pull the lid back just enough to make it look closed. So yeah, back to the maps. I drew the first one without even going underground. Why bother? I already knew every inch of it. Dozens of lids open and closed. Hundreds of hours spent underground. Thousands of memories stored away in the corners of my mind. My parents? What parent knows what their kid's doing from 1 in the afternoon to 6 in the evening? After 6, I diligently did my homework, watched TV, and even, I remember, took scuba classes at the Ural pool. Our instructor was Oleg Mikhailovich, a great guy, though I don't remember his last name. Later there was Vasya Dmitriev, but I didn't catch his run. Anyway, slight detour there. Or maybe not. It was at that pool that I realized something obvious. The underground network had to have other exits besides just manholes and storm drains. More than once in my underground explorations, I found full-height steel doors marked electrical room or something similar. I usually avoided them, but once, running through the gym with some guys, we were trying to peek at the girls in the locker room. I spotted a door on the girls' side of the corridor with the same label, and it was slightly ajar. Right then, all the naked girls flew out of my head, because behind a tangle of wires I saw a tunnel, and it looked exactly like the ones underground. Something clicked in my head, and the map of 70th District began to grow in my imagination with new, previously unknown connections. I didn't try to sneak into the electrical room that day. We were running from an angry janitor. I never actually went inside, but years later when I saw that door from the inside, I remembered it all and couldn't help but smile. From that day on, I stopped ignoring the doors I came across in the underground tunnels. Often they hid small storage spaces, just a couple of shovels, a bucket or two, a fire extinguisher. But sometimes they led to real corridors, usually taking me to the basements of apartment buildings or even more exotic places. For instance, how many people know that beneath the tiles surrounding the Lenin Monument is a sewer access hatch? It's covered not with a lid, but with one of those very tiles I think the second from the left corner. I listened to the May 9th, 1975 Victory Day speech from the City Party secretary right from there. Or that the Citibank's basement has a tiny half-height door that opens onto a rusted valve and some old pipes, and behind that, a small gap you can crawl through. I used to squeeze in and listen to the clank of vault doors and safe drawers echoing overhead. Or that you can break into many first-floor apartments in old buildings just by lifting the floorboards in the kitchen. I never did it, but I knew plenty of their family secrets. A different kind of person might have gotten hooked on all that eavesdropping and spying, but thankfully, I didn't care much for it. But when I saw pregnant girls who didn't know who the father was, or couples sweetly smiling at each other after a night of screaming matches, I didn't feel superior. Well, maybe a little awkward. Let me be clear. I was really lucky to start crawling down there at such a young age. I could fit through gaps that, 5 years later, would be impossible. If I had only discovered it all at 16, I probably would have dropped the whole thing. But by that age, I knew so many detours and alternate routes that I was sure I could get just about anywhere. Oh, and there's one more kind of space I haven't mentioned yet. Some of the doors led to short dead-end corridors, usually no more than 8 meters long, going nowhere, connecting to nothing. They were surprisingly well finished and totally pointless. However, they had another feature. I didn't notice it right away, though eventually I did. Sometimes in those corridors, or rather beneath their floors, there was a steady, distant hum. Since early childhood, I knew I lived in a special city, a secret city, a city tied to a mystery. What this mystery was, I had not the slightest idea, and probably that's what made it seem so grand and significant. These days, everyone is very smart. Everyone knows everything. But I, all the way through to the end of my studies, had no clue that atomic bombs were being made in my hometown. And when, after 5.5 years of studying in Leningrad, I arrived by assignment, or rather, by summons at the RFNC, and finally found out what most of the city's residents did day in and day out, I was shocked. Shocked to the core. But not for the reasons you might think. Not by the terrifying proximity of nuclear weapons. And not by the involvement in a crucial state endeavor. No, I was shocked by how petty and meaningless the mystery turned out to be. And I didn't believe that this was the mystery. And I still don't believe it. What happened after I returned to the city? Probably the same as for everyone else. I became a design engineer with a decent salary at the time, 160 rubles. I got involved in cultural activities, had fun at komsomol parties, worked as a counselor at Orleanok, went hiking in the spring, spent vacations in Leningrad, visiting friends and relatives. Then came meeting my future wife, a honeymoon in the then still peaceful Caucasus, the birth of my son, then daughter. And after that, dead end. The collapse of everything. The country, work, human relationships, marriage, ultimately, I won't talk about that. My years at university sort of snatched several years from my life, leaving unconnected to the city. In this sense, I was lucky. When I returned, I saw the city through the eyes of a different person, someone free of stereotypes and illusions. As a child, you don't think much about life's flow around you, so the city that appeared before me now was a completely new object, one I still had to study and come to terms with. I realized, for example, that I had no idea about the surroundings of the 70th, not the ones inside the perimeter, but those that bordered it. Our family didn't own a car, and if we went anywhere, it was only to Sverdlovsk or Chelyabinsk by bus. So everything within a 50-kilometer radius was an unknown territory to me. I still remember a recurring nightmare that haunted me until I finished university. By some chance, I end up somewhere beyond the checkpoint in the area of either 21st or Kishtyn, and I have to find my way back to the city, a task almost impossible. Because on one hand, I don't even roughly know which direction the city might be, though its proximity is a given, and on the other, I'm bound by the damn secrecy that prevents me from asking a simple question to a passerby about where the 70th is. A place that, I'm sure, even the local dogs know. So, in desperation, and unable to wake up, I have to come up with an elaborate plan to get to the city through regional centers, because there I can ask anything, and thank God, I know exactly where our buses stop in those places. That's why I eagerly threw myself into studying the local area. The call of the mystery hadn't yet sounded clearly, but its distant echoes were already reaching me, stirring my soul with vague premonitions. Countless conversations with residents of 21st, Vozdvizhinka, Kliuchi, and Selki became a window into a new space of images and perceptions of our city. And now, I don't even remember who was the first to drop that phrase about the land that Snezhinsk now occupies. A phrase that burned itself into my memory forever. No one has ever lived here. It shook me. I don't know what chord it struck in me, but my first impulse was to make sure it wasn't just idle talk. My ex-wife, who worked and still works at the library, ordered me everything from the Chelyabinsk archive, even remotely related to our region. It looked like a lot had been removed during the time the city was being built and classified, but what remained was more than enough. Indeed, no one ever lived here. Yes, they picked blueberries here, hunted goats between Lysaya, Shumasheva, Volchia, and Teplaya, dug exploratory shafts in search of stones. They logged timber for the Vozvezhensky glass factory, tying it into rafts and floating it across the Sinara. They built temporary fishing camps, but lived? No. Okay, the Russians came here relatively late, but what about the Bashkirs, whose ancestors settled here nearly half a millennium before the arrival of various Cossack bandits? What kept them away? I dove into toponymy. After going through a pile of literature, I made two very important discoveries, which confirmed I wasn't chasing shadows. First, I found a precise explanation for the name Sinara, around which much romantic nonsense has been spun. The first part, Sin, clearly means, in southern Bashkir and Kazakh, a burial site, a grave, sometimes a monument standing on a grave. Trying to link this word to the Kazakh, Sin, meaning true, is contrived and absurd. The second part, Ara, translates as interval, middle. For example, Arakal means lake between mountains. Thus, Sinara means lake between burial grounds or lake near burial sites. I'd even venture to suggest another shade of meaning, lake near death. Second, to my amazement, I discovered that one decree from the Chancellery of the Special Iset province of the Orenburg Governorate, dated the 3rd day of March, year 1737 since the birth of Christ, mentions a hill one verst from the southern shore of a lake named Sinara to the south, which the Tatars call Urami. Whether you like it or not, that's the hill in the center of the city where the music school now stands. There are no other hills in the area south of the lake, but that's not even the main point. Let's forgive the author's mention of Tatars. They were clearly Bashkirs, but the interpretation of the toponym is known to many school kids here, though who went on hikes with Sergei Mikhailovich Roshupkin to Yurma, one of the highest mountains in the southern Urals near Karabash. In Bashkir, Yura means to walk, May is a negation, do not walk, a clear warning of danger, and in our case, likely a prohibition against approaching the area, since, of course, there's no climbing to speak of. When I shared this discovery with 2 or 3 local authorities, they advised me not to clutter my head with unverified rumors and nonsense, saying people had always lived here, that ancient settlements from the Bronze and early Iron Ages had been found by the lake, with solid evidence of fishing and animal husbandry. Yes, I know all that. Back in '76, Yurka Karpov told me how he found clay shards and arrowheads on Pitushak. And I know about other findings too, but don't you care what the experts say about those finds? Real experts, no are homegrown schliemans. You do care. Good. Then let me show you the report from the Ural University History Department, which reviewed all those finds. The settlements were abandoned suddenly. The objects left behind show no signs of fire or destruction. No remains of the dead were found, which is very unusual in the case of sudden enemy attack. People simply left. Why? Because you weren't supposed to be here. Just weren't. And if you weren't supposed to, you're meh. These were just the first strokes in the broader picture I would later assemble. The build-up to critical mass. The first steps toward the mystery. About work. At first, before all the turmoil of perestroika and post-perestroika hit, I actually liked it. You had to think, solve problems, keep your brain active. But the job's special nature for me wasn't in the uniqueness of designing special products. Any form of creativity is unique, but in the regime's theatrical setting, the regime rules were frankly amusing. I emphasize amusing, not irritating like they were to many of my coworkers. It all felt like a game in a special education center. It was funny that instead of just grabbing a sheet and starting to draw or calculate, you had to go through a bunch of bizarre ritualistic actions, each completely meaningless and doing nothing to achieve its supposed purpose. Ensuring secrecy. Let me stress this point, because the fun ended once I realized that, from a systems theory perspective, this was what's called redundancy. Not duplication, redundancy. Duplication increases reliability, but redundancy introduces destructive elements into a system, sharply reducing its reliability. That is, the level of secrecy protocols at our enterprise was completely mismatched to the actual goal. I proved this mathematically and reached one clear conclusion. Either these protocols were developed by a complete idiot, which I doubt very much, or they had nothing to do with preserving the secrecy of nuclear weapons. Did I explain that poorly? Let me try again. Say you spot a pickpocket eyeing your wallet on the bus. You move the wallet to a less accessible pocket. That's logical. But if you see he's still watching you, you move it again and then again, just to throw him off. Soon, you're constantly switching pockets. Your first action actually protected your valuables, but the rest are pointless. They just tell the thief that you have something valuable. Most likely, you'll end up losing the wallet anyway. But all those moves make perfect sense. If the wallet is empty and your real money, and it's a lot, is in your inner jacket pocket. If my thoughts had followed one another in the order I am describing to you now, I would have uncovered the secret at least 5 years earlier. But the thing is, these were isolated thoughts, glimpses, impressions that refused to tie into a single thread for a long time. What I regret most is how dismissively I treated my uncle's story about Berea. If not for my so-called rationality, I would have known everything as early as 1993. But let's go in order. After the divorce, I began descending into my underground chambers again, after quite a long break. Honestly, I wasn't thinking about the secret down there. I was just trying to escape my despair and hopelessness, the sense that life was going nowhere. The utility corridors of the new districts, all those Sarcophagus, Prostokvashinos, and Golodeivkas, didn't appeal to me at all. Their utilitarian primitiveness filled me with disgust. So, most often, I wandered beneath the old city, glad that nothing had changed there, that everything was just as it was in the distant, happy days of my childhood. During one of these wanderings, I ended up in one of those very same dead-end corridors I had already mentioned. I remembered how I used to hear a faint humming here, and even the floor would tremble slightly underfoot. But now, it was dead quiet, as calm as a grave. Shining my flashlight at my feet, I walked the perimeter of the corridor. In the branches, I instinctively followed the right-hand rule, brushing the wall lightly as I moved. I was about to head out through the ajar door when something suddenly stopped me. For as long as I could remember, corridors like this one had always carried a faint background noise. That thought alone didn't mean much. Some nearby transformer or pump could have broken down or been shut off, obviously. But when I shifted the focus of my conclusion, it led me to a completely different and startling realization. Back in my childhood explorations, only these particular corridors, the ones whose purpose was unclear, had been linked to that mysterious noise. Once again, I felt a breath of the mystery. Just a mystery for now, not yet the secret I would later chase with full awareness. But great secrets always begin with small ones. When I got home, I dug into the sofa where I kept my old diaries, school notebooks, lecture notes, and other paper junk. Sneezing from the dust, I dug through it all and, from beneath a stack in the far corner, pulled out a worn 48-page notebook titled Labyrinths in flowery handwriting. I carefully opened it and, with excitement, began flipping through the pages. In front of me were clumsily drawn diagrams with naive labels for valves and siphons, with careful warnings like, "Careful here, hot pipe," and numbers showing the number of steps between various access points. I couldn't believe my eyes. As a kid, I'd done an enormous amount of work, probably comparable to the efforts of Livingstone, Stanley, and the like. Of course, I remember drawing all of this, mapping the layout of the utility tunnels, always hiding the notebook from my parents and sister in the second row of the bookcase. I remembered everything, but I was still struck by my childhood persistence, focus, and energy. Struck. Me, a 36-year-old man who'd grown disillusioned, let himself go, given up. And yet that very energy spurred me on. It made me act. After reviewing the notebook, I realized the diagrams wouldn't work for me. They gave a full picture of the tunnels and pipes, but lacked any sense of scale. What I needed now was precise scaled mapping to confirm a specific hypothesis. It took me exactly a year to create a detailed map of Snezhinsk's underground infrastructure. Everything was there: water supply systems, sewage, heating networks, electrical grids, telecom lines, gas pipelines, basements, and obscure or little-known underground structures, and much more. How I acquired those blueprints, I'll keep quiet about that. Not because what I did was strictly illegal, though most of the documents were classified, mostly for internal use, but because the people who, either knowingly or unknowingly, helped me gain access are still working in their offices. Let them keep working. Don't get the idea that I built my map solely from the blueprints, most of which, by the way, I never even ended up using. For that whole year, from summer 1997 to May 1998, I practically lived underground. Fortunately, I had the time. You know what a mess work was? Even if you wanted to get something done, others in the chain would just get in the way with their own problems. So most people had long figured out the only way to survive in our secret box. sit still, and wait for payday. That was the only way. And the boss, he didn't care where you were, in the office or anywhere else. Maybe others had it different, but mine and I always had an understanding. Anyway, by early summer, the map was done, and I dove into serious analysis. I compared the layout of the infrastructure at different levels and analyzed how it connected with surface buildings. I could go on and on about what I did. Statistical calculations to determine the variance and standard deviation of selected parameters, topological modeling of areas I was interested in, learning about trenchless pipe installation techniques, digging through piles of technical documentation, including obscure standards, norms, regulations, and manuals. In my head, I even awarded myself the title of Candidate of Technical Sciences, something I'd been hopelessly chasing for 10 years working at RFNC. The main result of my research was this. I found 6 spots where the infrastructure violated existing standards in a very specific and similar way. I'm not talking about sloppy work. Hell, I've never seen a utility tunnel without at least some shoddy workmanship. Officials would be horrified to see them in person. No, this was something different. At those 6 points, the infrastructure, against all logic and regulation, made a huge arc, at least 10 meters in radius, despite there being no visible obstacle. Then it would return precisely to its original direction. And, most strikingly, the center of each arc was located right behind the end wall of those same dead-end corridors that had fascinated me 20 years ago. Didn't feel a chill run through you? No shiver down your spine? Nothing? Then you won't understand me. Won't understand why when I first realized this, I started laughing like a madman, gasping for breath, wheezing, cackling, and just couldn't stop until I finally realized I physically couldn't stop. That it was hysteria. Only then did I calm down, and this from someone who used to be, well, somewhat reserved. No point in hiding these locations now that I've decided to tell you everything. Here are the surface landmarks that roughly correspond to them. First, the Univermag department store. Second, the Yubileny complex. Third, that same stinking building number 11 on Pobedi Street. You know, the long one opposite and slightly diagonally across from the bus stop. Fourth, the small hill by Senera, or more precisely, the parking lot near building number 25. Fifth, school number 21. And finally, sixth, a new surgical building, though it's not so new anymore. Naturally, you're now mentally trying, and failing, to figure out what could possibly connect these locations. 2 stores, an apartment building, a parking lot, a school, a hospital. What do they have in common? You might think about when they were built, but that doesn't help much either. Yubileny and number 11 were completed in the late 60s, Univermag and School 21 in the mid-70s, the surgical building in the early 80s. Nothing matches. Maybe the only thing they have in common is the peculiar anomaly in the infrastructure beneath and the existence of those dead-end corridors. There is something else. Here's the city map. Watch carefully. I connect those points with lines. What do we get? Exactly what I expected. A hexagon. Not a perfect one, but close. Now look again. Isn't there another simple geometric shape, different from the one drawn, that could also pass through these 6 points? Come on, use your imagination. That's right, a perfect ellipse. So if you have even a tiny bit of reasoning ability, not to mention imagination, then you probably won't be surprised, nor will you say my actions were completely irrational when on Friday, July 3rd. No, wait. It was already Saturday the 4th. I waited until the drunken crowd had dispersed from Yubileny, along with the inevitable police patrol, then quietly opened one of the 2 manholes on the left slope of the complex, tossed down a pickaxe I'd hidden in the grass in advance, and slipped inside, sliding the heavy cover shut behind me. Getting to the metal door that hid that all-too-familiar dead-end corridor, opening it and stepping inside. That took no more than 4 minutes. The pickaxe in my hand made my intentions pretty clear. I figured out long ago that the wall opposite the entrance hid a void behind it, same as the walls in the 5 other corridors. The only reason I picked this one was because Yubileny buzzed closest to my apartment. The first swing of the pickaxe was deafening. I stepped back and pulled the door shut tighter, trying to cover myself just in case. Then I returned to the concrete wall and took another swing. The concrete wasn't giving in easy. Bits of rubble and dust rained down onto the floor, while the wall itself only got a few pitiful scratches. The flashlight standing on my duffel lit up a small patch of wall. I twisted shadow dancing across it in some surreal performance. But things got better. I got the hang of it, and soon I had to step aside from time to time to dodge big chunks falling down. Sweat ran down my face, but it kept swinging like clockwork. Then suddenly, I felt a draft. I turned around. The door was still closed. That's when it hit me. I stepped up to the wall and saw a tiny hole in the center of the crater I'd made. I pressed my eye to it, desperate, but all I saw was darkness. Flashlight didn't help either. Couldn't shine and look at the same time. Gripping the pickaxe tighter, I felt I was close and started hammering the wall like a man possessed. The hole grew, egg size, then fist size, then head size. Then a massive chunk of wall just vanished, crashing out into the darkness beyond. I nearly fell in after it, and the pickaxe slipped from my hands and dropped into the void. A second later, I heard it hit, a deafening crash, echoing a dozen times over. When everything went quiet, I just sat there by the door, frozen for 5 minutes. I was sure the whole city must have heard that god-awful noise. In my mind, I pictured a SWAT team already descending the stairs, ready to take me dead or alive, preferably dead, I recalled from some cheesy action flick. It took me a long time to believe that no one else had heard a thing. Then I randomly remembered I had about 150 grams of medical alcohol in a baby food jar in my duffel. Yeah, I came prepared. Figured it was the perfect time for it. I filled the jar to the brim with canteen water and knocked back the non-Mendeleev-approved cocktail in one go. And you know what? It helped. A minute later, I was talking out loud to myself, but I didn't really care. The shake stopped. That explorer instinct kicked back in. I edged closer to the hole and cautiously shined a light into the dark. About 10 meters straight ahead, a faint spot of light flickered on the far wall. I swept the beam around and spotted another wall, off to the right, and a low ceiling, seemingly the same one from my corridor. I hesitated before pointing the light down. I had to stick my head and shoulders through the hole to do that, and there was no way in hell I was doing that. I could practically see another chunk of concrete crumbling off, taking me with it down into the unknown. The drop was about 7 meters. The part of the hall I could see looked completely empty, aside from the debris I'd knocked loose and my pickaxe lying a bit off to the side. I leaned out a bit further to look left and let out a surprised, half-laughing grunt. I hadn't even dared to hope for something like this. Just about a meter below the hole, right under me, were metal brackets embedded in the wall and a makeshift ladder leading downward. I remember the weird sense of joy that hit me. Maybe the booze helped, but whatever. If I'd been religious, I probably would have said a prayer of thanks. Instead, I started belting out Yellow Submarine at the top of my lungs, amazed how far my voice echoed in the underground. The euphoria might not have been so intense if I thought to ask myself a simple question. Who the hell was that ladder made for? And where does it even lead? I suddenly sobered up. My movements grew calm and focused. I tied the duffel to the climbing rope and lowered it down, followed by the lit flashlight on the other end. Then I dropped the rope itself. I had to take off my jacket too. Couldn't squeeze through the hole with it on. Finally, to the triumphant blare of imaginary fanfare, I landed on the floor of the hall. "We've arrived," I said out loud. The flashlight beam hit the far end of the hall, a wall I already knew. I quickly bent down, grabbed it, and turned it in the other direction. The light revealed nothing. I almost dropped the flashlight. It was so sudden, so unexpected, and honestly, terrifying. For a moment, I thought I was standing on the edge of some massive chasm, helpless and exposed. But only for a moment. The light trembled in my hands and slid across a curved wall. A tunnel. A giant tunnel, 10 meters wide, sloping downward at about a 30-degree angle into the dark. Once I pulled myself together, I started examining what I could with my not-so-powerful flashlight. Yeah, this was serious. Massive concrete walls, rough surface, metal reinforcing rings, and a basic stairway, step-by-step way down into the dark, where the flashlight beam hit the dark, where the flashlight couldn't reach. I didn't think long. I put on the jacket, packed up the rope, slung the duffel over my shoulders, hung the flashlight on my chest, and started climbing down. The steps were wide and easy to walk on. I could have done it blindfolded, but I wasn't looking to fall into some random pit, so went slow, angling the flashlight to light up the way ahead. Every now and then I pointed it forward, but all I could see was more tunnel ringed with metal bands. Around step 100, I started calculating how deep I'd gone. 15 meters, at least. By step 130, I thought I saw the edge of the tunnel ceiling. 10 steps later, I was sure of it. Something opened up ahead, still hidden in darkness. At step 200, the descent ended. The flashlight beam rose slowly from the floor. I was standing in a metro station. Yes, I was in a metro station. You won't understand what I felt. You were prepared from the very beginning of my story to accept what I'm about to say. That's why now you're probably thinking to yourself, well, finally he got there. But you have no access to the thoughts and feelings I had at that moment. Maybe I just don't know how to tell a story properly, how to build suspense. If you weren't even slightly surprised by what I saw, if you're sitting there now with your blank, politely calm faces, sure, maybe you just don't believe me. That would be a different matter. But if even one of you doesn't think I'm making this up, then try to understand my shock. The secret turned out to be nothing like what I imagined. Honestly, I was ready for anything. I was prepared to find an ancient labyrinth, or a massive bomb shelter, a powerful particle accelerator, a food storage hub, underground factories, missile silos, or even, why not, grim strategic transit tunnels. But to stumble upon an underground palace, that was beyond me. That went against every guess and theory I had. Dragging my heavy legs, I walked forward over a thick layer of dust that covered the marble floor. I felt sick. The design of the station stood in stark contrast to the rough tunnel I had just climbed down. My flashlight beam picked out slim metal columns clad in ribbed stainless steel with inlays of deep pink rhodonite, mosaics made of small decorating ceiling panels, and a tall statue standing in a niche at the far end of the station. I simply don't have the right words to describe it. Just picture one of the grand stations of the Moscow Metro, and you get the idea. Of course, there was none of the shine, brightness, or polished cleanliness a metro passenger would expect. The only light came from my flashlight, and as I said, everything was covered in dust. But the dust lay evenly, untouched. There was no sense of filth or neglect. More like the station had been draped in a fine veil, as if to slightly dull its overwhelming splendor. The resemblance to the Moscow Metro lay mainly in the level of aesthetics, in the architecture and artistry. The difference, well, technically there were two big differences between this and a normal metro station. First, it was about half the usual length, maybe 40 or 50 meters tops. And second, it was single-sided, meaning there was only one track tunnel with the rail line passing to the right of the platform, relative to the tunnel I came through. The tunnel diameter seemed significantly larger than any I had seen before. I walked along the platform and approached a copper-colored statue about 3 meters tall, standing in the niche across from me. No doubt about it, Igor Vasilievich Kurchatov, but not the stern, distant Kurchatov from the monument on the 20th site. Here he was depicted with a cheerful grin, his famous beard poking forward slightly. He held a model of an atom, tiny balls of electrons attached to wire ellipses. The whole statue radiated health, joy, and optimism. I even smiled, though I didn't feel cheerful at all. Soviet atomic scientists have fulfilled their duty to the motherland. I.V. Kurchatov, I read on the granite-faced pedestal. And those words, especially the now outdated term atomic, made me flinch. A chill ran down my spine and a lump caught my throat. I felt the breath of history on me. I felt as if I'd been transported back to an age of collective joy and blazing enthusiasm. A time when people still knew why they worked and lived, and were proud of it. A time of eternal youth and a bright future. For a moment, it felt unreal that above me, people were cursing the president, scrambling to find any money at all, unable to feed their kids, and most of all, seeing nothing ahead but creeping old age and its grim companion. A massive mosaic mural covering the far wall of the station caught my eye and held it for a long time. I'd call it the history of the atom. Maybe that's what it was really called. Surrounded by cathode tubes, nuclear reactors, synchrophasitrons, exploding supernovas, flasks, retorts, and all kinds of physics equations, with the inevitable E equals mc squared at the center, were Lomonosov and Becquerel, the Curies, Rutherford, Einstein, Fermi, Kurchatov, and Landau. It was thanks to Lev Davidovich, by the way, that I later guessed the station must have been designed no earlier than 1968. Looking at the pattern on the marble floor, I didn't immediately realize it was a stylized atom. The originality was in the fact that each element of the floor's sprawling design contained a kind of self-similarity. The nuclear planetary structure repeated inside each electron, proton, and neutron, and within their components you could again make out a central nucleus and its orbiting particles. In my opinion, it was a brilliant visual metaphor for the infinity of matter's layers and their scale and variant nature. Honestly, it felt like a mathematician had drawn the floor plan. The vaulted ceiling had 2 panel lights alternating with 3 giant bronze chandeliers. On one of the panels, I could make out something like a spaceship soaring through space, and on the other, a panorama of a beautiful city with tall buildings and transparent flying vehicles hovering in midair. Maybe that's how the artist imagined Snezhinsk of the future. Right, the air. It was stale. Not smelly or hard to breathe, just like a room that hadn't been aired in years. Maybe it only seemed that way because I was subconsciously comparing it to the crisp circulating air of most metro systems. I don't know. Either way, it was clear that if there were any ventilation shafts here, the fans hadn't worked in a long time. The temperature felt no higher than 10 or 12 degrees. It was relatively dry. I jumped down from the platform and walked a bit into the tunnel. No air current, no telltale breeze from a train approaching. Thick cable bundles stretched along the walls, all covered in dust. The same dust coated the tracks, the sleepers, and the concrete foundation. I kicked the power rail mounted slightly above the running rails, but it was already obvious. No electricity lived here. Suddenly, I felt exhausted. I realized I was hanging on by a thread and only the alcohol was keeping from snapping from everything I'd seen. but its effects were wearing off. The chill crept in, a nervous tension that teetered on the edge of hysteria or full-blown panic. I knew that was enough for today. Time to go back. As I climbed the 200 steps, completely drained and empty inside, I realized what the slope tunnel was for. Escalators were supposed to be installed here. The drives, pulleys, tensioning mechanisms. Supposed to be? I asked myself. So where were they? But by then, my mind was too exhausted for any more questions. I barely made it up the ladder to the hole I'd broken through 2 hours earlier. The window to the familiar world, where my hometown of Snezhinsk slept soundly in its pre-dawn dream. I tossed up my backpack, jacket, and was just about to crawl through myself when I don't know what it was. Maybe I imagined it, a faint creak or screech somewhere far below. But I froze where I was, dangling 3 stories above the floor, my neck twisted unnaturally as I stared into the dark tunnel, straining to hear, feeling the cold settle deep in my gut. Then, as if snapping out of a trance, I heaved myself through the opening in one motion, shattering my flashlight in the process. Station Kurchatovskaya, I muttered nervously as I picked myself up in the pitch black and tried to fight the fear, clawing at me with the sound of my own voice. Exit to the Yubileny supermarket in school number 26. Caution, doors are closing. After that, I got sick. High fever and delirium. My brain refused to connect the dots. I wandered through dark tunnels, and the electric cables turned into snakes, biting at me. The walls closed in and crunched my body. I was constantly thirsty, constantly out of breath. The nights dragged on endlessly, while the days flew by so fast that at one point I seriously thought maybe the earth had stopped spinning. That maybe America was stuck in eternal daylight. In the sticky swamp of my nightmares, I kept trying to draw an ellipse through 6 points and couldn't, no matter how hard I tried. That, honestly, was the scariest part. The first real sensation that told me I was recovering was the fresh, damp air blowing in through a wide open window. August rain. After that, I started getting better. You think I lay in bed for weeks after that, gathering my strength and too scared to go back down? Hell no. I went back down 2 days after I first got up, went down, confirmed it all really existed, and came back up. That was enough for the first time. Sometimes I think the illness was sent from above, a sort of buffer, a breather, so I wouldn't lose my mind over all this underground madness. I started going down daily, well, nightly. During the day, I'd catch up on sleep at work. I completely checked out of regular life, cut almost all ties with anyone, except maybe my son and daughter. The underground, that was my only real world now. I stopped being afraid when I went down there, though I always wore a massive hunting knife on my belt now, just in case, remembering those weird sounds. The wonder wore off too. It felt like I was doing serious work, step by step, carefully and methodically. Yeah, I call it the dungeon. Sometimes, only half-jokingly, the Lominsky Metro. He's the only person in our town I wouldn't be embarrassed to name something after. But most often, I just call it the ring. There really are 6 stations, and each one, aside from the ever-present dust and lack of escalators, looks brand new, like it's just waiting for the ribbon-cutting ceremony and the orchestra to start playing. You know, I often imagine the stations lit up brightly, people crowding the platforms, laughing, joking, and from the tunnel a breeze picks up, and then a sleek, sparkling train bursts out like it's chasing the wind. And you know what? It chokes me up. I'd ride that blue train every damn day. I gave the stations my own names because, oddly enough, despite being fully finished, none of them had any of those metal letters spelling out names. I already mentioned Kurchatovskaya. It became my sort of base. From there, I had explored the tunnels from station to station. I widened the hole I'd found just enough to make it easier to climb in and out, and I installed a lock on the corridor door, just in case some random plumber decided to poke around. Past Kurchatovskaya, about 600 meters away, roughly under the middle of Pobedy Street. Underground, of course, there's a station I call Uralskaya. No other name fits. Picture red-brown granite columns with emerald green capitals made of serpentine and amazonite. Real trees, actual trees. Walking between them, you could forget you were underground and think you were in a forest. And the mosaic on the wall, beautiful mountains, mysterious lakes, deep forests, cheerful rivers. The eternal beauty of the ancient and ever-young Urals. And it's not made of regular tiles, but real Ural gemstones, mostly jasper of all colors and shades, with onyx, serpentine, ophiolite, and porphyry. A true treasure trove. At the end of the station is the amazing stone flower. The first time I saw it, I stood there for nearly an hour, couldn't take my eyes off it. Whoever carved it is a master, a real craftsman like Basil's Danila. Perched on the flower is a big red-green lizard, also made of stone. and behind it on the wall are characters from Ural folktales. Not in a classic style, but in something fresh and strangely captivating. Next down the line is Rabakaya, worker station, near Senera under a small hill. The massive pilasters along the platform have shallow niches with figures on low marble pedestals, made with galvanoplastic casting. I knocked, they're hollow. 7 in total, slightly taller than life-size. A scientist, old guy with an academic cap and a microscope. An engineer, middle-aged, using a slide rule. A doctor, tall woman with a stethoscope next to her little girl she's patting on the head. A worker, young guy holding a hammer by his side. A teacher, older woman with glasses, holding a globe. A boy stands beside her, pointing to Snezhinsk on it. I thought it was Moscow at first. A soldier, stern man with a rifle slung over his shoulder. And last, a kolkhoz girl, full-figured and cheerful, holding a sheaf of wheat. These statues reminded me of Ploshchad Revolutsiya station in Moscow, but clearly they were made by a different sculptor. Less stylized, but no less skillful. More human, more alive. Even with their slightly naive symbolism, they don't look silly. They radiate pride and soul. From Rabakaya, just like from the next station I call Snezhnaya, another tunnel branches off to the right. I'll get to those later. Snezhnaya, located under school number 121, blew me away with its white marble finish and other white materials. At first, I didn't really get the charm of it. The dust and darkness ruined the effect. But once my imagination learned to picture the dungeon as it should be, brightly lit, clean, cheerful, only then, by mentally pushing through the soul-crushing gray, did I really feel the gentle, barely there magic of a winter fairy tale coming from every part of that station. Under the surgery building is a station I eventually named Zoologiskaya, though I know the name doesn't quite fit. It needs something softer, more intimate. In the center stands something like a giant tree, or maybe a rock covered in creeping vines, and on it are perched all sorts of forest animals. On the lower ledges, moose, bear, wolf, and boar. A level up, lynx, deer, hare, capercaillie. Higher still, squirrels, martins, crows, woodpeckers. At the very top, the giant winged kite. All of them cast from black iron. Anyone can tell it's classic Castley casting. The gray-blue marble columns flare out at the top, like some kind of strange fantasy plants. I think the lights are hidden behind those capitals, and I imagine the soft, golden light they cast, like sunlight shining down on the centerpiece. On the wall is another mosaic, a massive swirling pattern where dozens, maybe hundreds of animals flow into each other, so you can't even tell where one ends and the next begins. I think kids would go nuts over that station, staring in amazement for hours at the anonymous master's work. And finally, the last station, Ploshchad Lenina. I'm sure that's what it was meant to be called. Up by the ceiling, the bas-reliefs show young Volodya Ulyanov. We'll take a different path. The hut at Rezliv, the speech from the armored car, peace to the people. All those scenes from famous paintings. In the niche at the far end stands a bronze Lenin, arm outstretched, and behind him the Aurora fires her salvo, while workers and sailors rush forward with rifles. Alright, I'm getting carried away. You probably don't care about the design of these stations, because the one question burning on your tongue is obvious. Fine, I'll get to that in a second, but let me just say this. The person who designed this Snezhinsk Metro was a genius. A genius because they captured the very essence of the city, made its immortal soul real and visible. Just think about it. Beautiful people surrounded by beautiful reality, a reality that helps them create and inspires them to reach even higher. The bold Kurchatovskaya, Robochaya, and Ploshchad Lenina represent labor, creativity, and revolutionary drive toward the future, while the softer Uralskaya, Snezhnaya, and Zoologiskaya support them with harmony, tenderness, and purity. I wish I could live in a world like that. Yes, I understand your impatience. Wandering through the cave-like tunnels and admiring the palatial station halls, I, just like you now, was tormented by the same question. Why the metro? And that question instantly split into dozens of smaller ones. When was it built? Who built it? What was it for? Why don't the townspeople know anything about it? Why was it never put into operation? Why weren't escalators installed? Step by step, I managed to find answers to some of these questions, but I still couldn't answer the main one. The first thing that became clear from the very beginning was that the construction of the metro, for some unknown reason, had been wrapped in a level of secrecy that can make the wildest dreams of any security agency employee look tame. The degree of secrecy is evident from the fact that in a city where you can hear nuclear secrets at every turn, despite supposedly top-notch security, The overwhelming majority of the population had never even heard of this construction. Not even once, and even a single mention would have been enough to spark rumors. After much thought, I concluded that the metro had been built over a span of about 15 years, from the mid-60s to the late 70s. I placed the lower bound based on Uncle Kolya's story. Of course, it was in 1966 that the trainload of equipment disappeared without a trace and never turned up anywhere in RFNC. And judging by his words, it wasn't the only one. Most likely, to maintain secrecy, different people were in charge of different parts of the project, and not all of them shared Uncle Kolya's level of competence or insight. You drop it off, sign the paper, and that's the end of it. I placed the upper bound from memories of my teenage years crawling underground. I distinctly remember hearing the unmistakable hum of electric trains below, and now, recalling that sound, I'm absolutely sure it came from metro trains. That meant work was in full swing at the time, and the metro was being prepared for operation. The fact that the work seems to have ended in the 70s also came from the stylistic elements of the station's architecture and decoration, clearly from that era. And since station finishing is typically done last, something must have happened just before the launch. As for who built it, I never reached a firm conclusion. I don't want to sound ridiculous by guessing, but I am convinced there must be people in Snezhinsk who were involved in its construction. No two ways about it. Maybe some of them, just a few. Otherwise, the secret would have leaked. We're fully in the know and even now understand everything I'm describing here, and those people can keep secrets. Others likely worked there without even realizing where they were. Bet a cover story, made to sign non-disclosures, driven to the site in sealed trucks, and so on. But I believe the bulk of the workforce consisted of military engineers, not from our construction battalion, and possibly even prisoners brought in for rotational shifts. Maybe they even lived down there, although I found no direct evidence of that. You might ask, how is that even possible? Metro construction always starts with a shaft that removes thousands of cubic meters of earth. Where are those shafts in Snezhinsk, and what about all the soil they dug up? Why didn't the townspeople notice? I couldn't answer that for a long time either. I'll return to the question of soil later, but as for the shafts, I can tell you for sure, 2 shafts were dug in the city, and people didn't know about them for a simple reason. They were located on regular, unremarkable construction sites. Where exactly? Well, think hard. You can figure this out yourself. A little hint. Remember the notorious long-term construction projects on 70th that dragged on for nearly a decade? Think back to your hometown's history. Remember? That's right. One of them was the endlessly delayed surgical wing. And by the way, the banner, "Glory to the city's founding builders," hung on its unfinished facade for so long, it started to feel like it was built by the founding generation. In a second? Yes, exactly. The whole complex on Lenin Square, the department store, the communication center, and the Snezhinsk building. Think about it. How do you explain such drawn-out construction in a city with solid funding? Doesn't it seem suspicious how these projects overlap with places I've already mentioned? I won't drag this out. The answer's simple. The main shaft lies beneath the surgical building. In fact, I'll go further. That shaft was built along the path of some much older workings. I found many horizontal drifts, which I haven't had time to explore yet. Just walking down one of them, I saw it stretched over 300 meters, and there are dozens more. I believe, or rather, I'm certain, that the first metro builders descended through these older shafts, and later, the main shaft was widened. But here's the thing. The shaft is wide enough to accommodate many workers, but completely unsuitable for transporting massive amounts of soil to the surface. There is a cage for about 20 people, and it still exists, but there's no setup for moving rock. No inclined shafts with skips, no carts, no conveyors, nothing. What? Escalator tunnels? Those inclined tunnels I mentioned earlier don't and never did reach the surface. Everything I've just said also applies to the second shaft, under the department store, though it's slightly smaller in diameter. Of course, there are no longer any access points from the basements to these shafts, simply because the shaft mouths are now covered by slabs and sealed in the concrete foundations of those 2 very familiar buildings. But here's another mystery. The 4 remaining stations have no shafts at all. How did workers even get there? The only answer is through a gradually extended tunnel. From the standpoint of getting workers to the site, maybe that's fine. Hop on a trolley and ride in. But delivering tunneling machines and hauling out soil that way, that's another story. Yet the fact remains, the metro was built almost entirely from the inside out. Even things like ventilation shafts, which are normally best built from the surface, where there's room to maneuver, were, judging by many signs, also dug from below. Speaking of ventilation shafts, their above-ground parts still exist. I climbed up through a few myself. In 5 out of 6 cases, they're hidden inside transformer substation buildings. The ventilation grills are surrounded by distribution panels welded shut, but the grills themselves haven't been sealed up, which must allow fresh air to flow into the metro even if the fans are off. This partly explains why escalators were never installed. Installing escalators would have meant connecting to the surface, and that would have meant declassifying the entire project. No doubt that was part of the original plan, though now and then a crazy thought creeps in that I try to push away, that maybe the Snezhinsk Metro was built as a thing in itself, just for the sake of it. But the declassification never happened. For reasons unknown, right before completion, the order came to immediately shut it all down. Immediately, or in an emergency. The second seems closer to the truth. No urgency explains why millions of rubles worth of equipment was simply left down there. Left or abandoned. The first time that thought hit me, I felt sick. I remember running through the dark tunnel from Lenin Square back to Kurchatovskaya, stumbling, falling, getting back up, cursing myself for being an idiot. My brain whispered the answer, and I nearly had a breakdown. Radiation. How did I not think of that? The tunnels were radioactive, and I was down there, gawking like a moron, clueless about what was lurking around me. I thought I was done for, a dead man walking. But back home, I pulled myself together, and before rushing off for a blood test, as I'd planned mid-run, I called a school friend who works at Site 20. He was startled by the 3 a.m. call. I realized the time only after, but the next day, I was down there with a dosimeter in hand, and I didn't stop until I had walked the entire ring. There was no radiation, but the questions remained, and there was one more problem that kept bugging me. Look here, I'll show you on the map. See this ellipse? It covers the 6th, 9th, and 12th microdistricts of Snezhinsk, the area bordered by Sverdlov, Vasilyev, Pobeda, Shelkin, and Novaya streets. Fine, let's ignore the new city for now. Maybe that part hadn't been planned back when the metro design was being drawn up. But tell me, why was the oldest part of town, east of Sverdlov, left without a single station? But that's not even the main issue. Even a child knows that metro systems are meant primarily to move people between residential areas and the city's main work hubs. Basically from home to work, so why doesn't the Snezhinsk Metro ellipse even touch Site 9? Using this metro for public transport would be laughable. It would take longer to get underground than just to walk to your destination. But there is a tunnel towards Site 9. I already mentioned the branch from Rabokaya. However, that tunnel raises more questions than it answers. First, it's narrower than the main ring tunnels, though it has the same track gauge. Second, it doesn't even reach Site 9. Somewhere around the city cemetery, or maybe a bit closer, it splits into 3 dead-end tunnels that form a depot. Not super important, but I'll say it anyway. There are 9 3-car train sets stored there, all in pretty decent condition. Oh, and there is another tunnel from Snezhnaya going in roughly the same direction, with the same diameter, but that one stops abruptly about 200 meters from the station. At the end sits a tunneling shield. No tracks laid, nothing. And although these tunnels, which I call sorting and dead end, aren't particularly noteworthy, I often found myself drawn to them from the ring line. I don't know why, but their strange differences always made me feel like the answer may lay there. I was wandering through those tunnels again on November 7th, hoping for a breakthrough, when something happened that I still can't recall without a shudder. I was walking from the depot down the sorting tunnel. I had about 200 meters to go until the switch, when I felt a pebble get into my right sneaker. I set my flashlight on the ground and bent down to untie my laces, and that's when I saw it. Huge footprints, clearly stamped into the dusty ties, with horrible, crooked claws. Who cares about Robinson Crusoe? He had a rifle in his hands, an axe on his belt, and he still found human footprints. I was crouched down, frozen, curled into a tight ball, waiting for some unknown beast to leap onto my back and start ripping me apart with its claws. The fear inside me was boiling over, mixed with a sharp sense of hopelessness. The only exit was 2 kilometers of tunnels away, and as you can imagine, there was nowhere to hide or turn off. I cursed myself for being so careless. I don't even know why, but in the 4 months I've been down here, I completely ruled out the idea that the dungeon might actually be dangerous. Those weird sounds I heard during my first visit, I brushed them off later as the beginnings of some paranoid breakdown. Each time I came back, I got more relaxed, more reckless. I even started forgetting my hunting knife. I didn't have it with me now. No weapon, no way to defend myself. I didn't even try to guess what kind of creature it might be. You try thinking straight in a moment like that. All I remember is one thought spinning in my head. Please, not rats. Anything but rats. The paralysis wore off slowly. I straightened up and carefully swept my flashlight into the darkness ahead. Then, just as slowly, behind me, nothing. Silence. Gradually, my brain started to work again. There couldn't be anything behind me. I come straight from the depot. No place to hide along the way. That meant the beast had been ahead of me. It must have turned back toward the ring line before I entered the sorting tunnel. I pointed the flashlight down at the tracks. There it was. Footprints going both directions. And my own prints were on top of them. Clear as day. My sneakers had landed inside the massive tracks like the creature had walked on the sleepers just like I did. I'm no tracker, but I spotted another set. Slightly smaller ones. So the thing walked on all fours, but what the hell could it have been? Now, I'm laying it all out clearly, but at the time it was just flashes of thought and raw instinct. Somewhere deep down my mind was piecing it together. The image of a giant rat with a greasy body, long stiff tail, and a disgusting snarl haunted me. But I forced myself to ignore that horror movie bullshit. I told myself, seriously now, it had to be a bear. Sure, where it came from was another question, but honestly, it was easier, and honestly less terrifying to imagine some massive predator like a bear in the metro than some mutant rat or giant hyena. There was only one way to go, so I moved forward slowly, stopping often to listen. For some reason, my first goal became reaching the next station. I figured once I got there, I'd have options. I could figure out where the beast had gone and maybe circle around the ring to make it to safety. Kurchatovskaya station. I reached the connection between the sorting tunnel and the ring. The ceiling of the ring tunnel was about 1.5 times taller, and the darkness instantly deepened like it opened its arms to welcome me. I aimed my light to the right, then to the left, and froze. Footprints everywhere. I'm not a tracker, like I said. Maybe the creature had wandered around here a week ago and I just didn't notice before. Right now I had to choose a direction. It was like that Buridan's donkey story, but instead of starving, I'd be eaten. I come to the depot from the direction of Rabakaya. I didn't see anyone or anything on the way in, so logically that was the safer way back. But how could I know the creature hadn't strolled over to Snezhinsk or Zoologiskaya while I was at the depot? And now I decided to pay a visit to Kurchatovskaya. What if I was walking right into its path? Or worse, what if it had been sitting on the stairs of Rabakaya or Uralskaya all along, waiting for me to come back? In the end, I headed toward the visible glow of Rabakaya, mostly because from there, it was closer to Kurchatovskaya. I kept telling myself the tracks would turn back soon, and I'd be in the clear. Suddenly, the beast jumped at me from the platform. It happened so fast I didn't even have time to be scared. In the flare of my flashlight as it flew upward, I saw just a narrow black and white face with fangs under a raised lip, and a light, almost white, furry body. I'm convinced pure dumb luck saved me. The thing was targeting the light of my mining flashlight, which I was carrying in front of me. That's why it missed, though it still knocked the flashlight out of my hand and sent me crashing to the ground. It slammed hard into the tiled wall. I jumped up and screamed like a maniac, bolted in the opposite direction. The fallen flashlight kept shining, its beam cutting behind me. I ran, seeing my shadow stretch out ahead, and then, just for a second, the light flickered out. I heard it then, the heavy, muffled footfalls of something chasing me. I heard its breathing, synced with the sound of claws scraping softly but powerfully across the concrete, and its shadow swallowed mine completely. Later, I realized I'd done the only smart thing. Sprinting into the sorting tunnel that veered to the right, I scrambled up the wall, grabbing onto any jutting piece of metal, clutching at the cables running along the sides. I blacked out for part of it, but I clearly remember this, holding onto a steel rod, trying again and again to swing my second leg over a thick cable running near the ceiling, when suddenly I felt the crash shake the wall. A second later, a cable snapped with a metallic twang. Then came the bone-chilling sound of claws scraping along metal. I'm not sure what had happened, but at some point I realized I was wedged between the tunnel ceiling and two thick cables running parallel to it. Don't ask how I got up there. Still no clue. My ass was hanging in the air, my forehead pressed to the ceiling, legs dangling off both sides. My backpack was gone. I half remember dropping it somewhere back in that deadly 100-meter sprint. Below me, loud guttural growls. It sounded like the creature was trying to reach or jump up to me, but wasn't having much luck. They gave me some hope. My position seemed solid, and at least I wasn't going to fall from exhaustion. For a long time, I couldn't make myself turn over and look. First, I thought I'd fall or the cable would snap. Second, I figured if I moved too much, it might drive the beast into a frenzy and it would get me. Third, I just didn't want to see it. Still, I started to shift. It took a while. The beast stopped pacing and, judging by the breathing, sat down directly below to watch me. I slowly moved my left leg over the right cable, bracing with my elbow on the left. Then I pulled my right leg in, tried to hook it over the other cable, missed. My body dropped in a swinging arc. I nearly slipped, felt air rush past my leg, and then thud. The monster hit the ground again, but my hands were locked onto the cables now. I yanked my leg back up, secured myself, and finally looked down. It wasn't a bear. Clearly, it wasn't going anywhere. Maybe this tunnel was its home. Or maybe, like a real predator, it was just going to sit and wait me out. Sure, I remembered badgers ate frogs, lizards, and snakes, but this one clearly had other priorities. It leapt at me. That was no defensive behavior. About 30 minutes passed. It kept pacing up and down the tunnel, sometimes walking off for a bit, but always coming back. By then, I was thinking clearly again, and I had all the time in the world. I had no weapons. I wasn't exactly strong, but I told myself if it came to it, I'd try to choke the thing out or snap its neck. Ridiculous, I know, it's not like it would let me do that, but I was ready to fight. I even thought about wrapping my left arm in my jacket to try and jam it into the thing's mouth. Not exactly a monk warrior, but I wasn't going down without a fight. I unzipped my jacket and stuck a hand into my pocket, hoping to find anything useful, and my fingers closed around a small object, just big enough to fit in my palm, a lighter. Salt is salty. The Volga flows into the Caspian Sea. All animals fear fire. Silly, but these elementary truths popped into my head when I felt a lighter in the pocket of my storm jacket. Imagine, the half-dark of the tunnel, a growling predator below, the glinting rails, and me pinned to the ceiling by cables, pondering philosophical problems. Not quite philosophical. It's not true that all animals fear fire, but all animals fear the pain caused by fire. The light of the flashlight didn't scare the badger, though perhaps it unsettled it somewhat. The beast, like a human, like any living creature, fears pain. Here was my chance. I almost screwed it all up. The idea came to me to unleash fire, then, by crushing the plastic lighter canister, pour a fiery waterfall onto the monster. If I had done that, I would undoubtedly have burst into flames instantly and, howling in pain, jumped right into the jaws of the badger. But my guardian angel was nearby, and after some thought, I abandoned that ridiculous plan. Pulling out the cord that tightens the hood from the storm jacket, I tied it in a knot on one of the cables and, turning the lighter wheel, cautiously lit it from below. The badger watched my actions warily, and when the flame flickered, it stepped slightly aside, hiding its snout. Apparently, the light did cause it some discomfort. The tiny flame at the end of my makeshift tinder didn't go out, and I moved on to the second part of my plan. Undressing beneath the ceiling was terribly inconvenient, but there was no choice. I hung the storm jacket and sweater side by side on the cable to dry. Tearing my t-shirt with my teeth, I ripped it into two pieces, then, pulling the belt out of my jeans, threaded one piece of the former t-shirt through the buckle and tied it in a knot. After that, I put the sweater back on, wrapped the storm jacket around my left arm, settled in as best I could, and carefully crushed the lighter canister, trying to get the contents on both pieces of the t-shirt. I knew the liquid evaporated instantly, so I had no time to hesitate. I quickly brought one piece to the tinder. The fabric ignited immediately, though not as strongly as I expected, and I dropped it down. I was lucky that when the flash of flame burst, the beast buried its head in its paws and didn't see the burning cloth drifting onto it. A deafening shriek screeched. The smell of burning filled the air sharply, but I wasn't looking down anymore. The belt tied around my right wrist, with the rag at the end, became my torch, and as soon as it flared, I freed myself from the cables and fell from the height of the second floor, landing quite well on my side without breaking anything. Time stretched out. Hearing the furious roar of the beast maddened by pain somewhere ahead, I climbed terribly slowly and still couldn't fully get up. Straightening, I discovered with horror that during the fall my torch had almost gone out, and the wheezing badger was already turning its face toward me, its rage on the brink of violent attack. But I, drunk on some feverish premonition of battle, probably inherited from my distant ancestors, let out a wild scream and rushed the enemy, and its fury turned to fear, which I felt throughout my body. Instead of sinking its teeth into my throat, it fled, and I ran after it, swinging the belt. My torch flared brightly, and I managed to strike its pale, twitching rear with my fiery sword. It shrieked wildly, like a rat caught in a trap, and dashed off even faster, spreading the smell of fear and burnt fur. I kept chasing it, shouting at the top of my lungs, wildly waving the belt. At the station, the beast jumped right onto the platform, dashed past two nearby pillars, and in the flickering light of my torch, I was amazed to see how it, as if flattened, squeezed itself into the narrow space no wider than 30 centimeters under the bench standing against the inner wall. The torch went out, and I dropped the belt onto the rails. Then I sat down, leaning my back against the contact rail. There was neither joy nor fear. The emotional and physical surge was replaced by complete collapse and indifference. I didn't care anymore. If the badger came back and started gnawing on me, it wouldn't interest me in the slightest. Later, I somehow pulled myself together. got my still working flashlight, trying but failing to be scared, thinking what would have happened if it broke, and then, completely unexpectedly, decided to go see where the beast had gone. Overcoming terrible pain in my whole body, I painfully climbed the metal ladder to the platform and limped into the hall. 7 figures still stood in their niches, and shining the flashlight around, I felt some relief seeing no 8th figure in sight. I don't remember if I said this before. Each station had 4 benches arranged along the wall opposite the platform. They blended into the station landscape differently, but there were always 4. So, under the second bench from the right, my recent companion disappeared. Leaning down, at first I couldn't see anything, and even doubted for a moment that it had happened here. The gap under the bench was so narrow that even I would hardly have fit through. But then I recalled how once a classmate of mine, now a biology and geography teacher, told me that rodents like mice and rats have skull bones, the smallest part, arranged so that when squeezing into a narrow gap, they fold over each other. Maybe this creature had such movable bones too? I lay down on the marble floor right by the bench, turned off the flashlight, and closed my eyes for a few seconds to better adjust to the dark. Then I pushed the flashlight forward so its sudden light wouldn't blind me, and turned it on. I expected to see a dark, winding burrow leading somewhere deep. Perhaps the predatory snout of the burrow's inhabitant. But what I saw was completely unexpected. Behind a concrete wall about 30 centimeters thick, I saw a tunnel. Just like any other tunnel connecting the stations of the Snezhinsk Metro. Exactly like that, but not quite. The tunnel had 2 rails laid, noticeably narrower than usual. On both narrow gauge tracks stood many low carts filled with soil, fading into the darkness. No cables ran along the tunnel walls. There was something else unusual about this tunnel, but what exactly I couldn't understand and didn't particularly try to. That was all. I didn't get to examine anything more. I won't lie. After lying on my stomach for about 3 minutes, I got up and, without any interest, headed away. Another tunnel, I thought weakly. Well, whatever. Maybe you won't understand me. How so, you will say? A secret metro, in a secret tunnel. How could you not be surprised? How could you pay so little attention to it? But try to understand me. All my senses were dulled, a normal protective reaction. I was just almost eaten by an unknown to science beast. I survived by a miracle, and you want me to be amazed by something, to think about something, or worse, to go back into its jaws. Still, some work was happening in my brain, and I was sure that sooner or later the results would surface. Meanwhile, I slowly put my storm jacket back on, hung the flashlight around my neck, and descended again to the rails. After some thought, I decided not to go back for my kit bag. It still lies somewhere there, near the sorting station, and, picking up the belt, leisurely made my way toward Kurchatovskaya. I somehow wasn't afraid of pursuit anymore. I want to end my story of that incident with a small, seemingly insignificant episode. When I had already passed Kurchatovskaya, the buckle of my belt, which I was aimlessly swinging around, struck the tunnel wall, unexpectedly sparking a bright flash. Mechanically, I scratched the fresh scratch on the whitewash with my nail and strolled on. Then I stopped and scratched the wall again. Then scratched in another place. I want to lie and say I understood everything at that moment. That would be very elegant, but it wouldn't be true. At that moment, I simply couldn't make any grand conclusions. But metaphorically comparing thought to a metro train, I can say that at that very moment my train entered the only possible tunnel leading to the destination station. Though if you ask me what I was thinking, hobbling through the dark corridors of the underground, climbing the steps of the escalator tunnel at Kurchatovskaya, squeezing through the still narrow hole of the blasted hatch, my words will surprise you, and you decide they have nothing to do with this whole story. But you would be wrong. Want me to tell you what I thought about? I thought about the Tubings. About Tubings. If you don't know what that is, let me explain it to you in the simplest terms. There are different methods of building subway tunnels, but one operation is always part of the process. After all the blasted or jackhammered rock is cleared away, the tunnel lining is assembled. It consists of cast iron rings that cover the entire inner surface. Each ring is made up of 12 tubing segments bolted together. Once the ring is assembled, the cycle repeats, and about a meter later, the next ring goes up, and so on. You've probably seen these black structures plenty of times while staring out the subway car window. So, I asked myself a question. Why, when running from that terrifying badger, did I risk death to cover an extra 100 meters instead of climbing the tunnel wall right after the attack? Sure, you could assume that my brain wasn't working right at the time, and I panicked, not realizing what I needed to do. But I would argue the opposite. My brain was working exactly as it should, even if I wasn't consciously aware of the logic behind my actions. And there was logic. Iron logic. Cast iron. The thing is, the tubing lining, The very stuff I grabbed onto to skillfully climb to the top only exists in the sorting and dead-end tunnels. Nowhere else in the Snezhinsk Metro system are there any tubings. Yeah, I wasn't just running for no reason. I was running to the sorting tunnel, the only place I could save myself from certain death. The walls of the ring tunnel are completely smooth, and the cables are all laid at about head height. Why, I wondered, had this piece of knowledge, which saved me in that critical moment, never surfaced in my thoughts or analysis before? I had definitely noticed the difference between the ring tunnel and the sorting tunnel, and not just because of the tubings. I had always mentally referred to the sorting tunnel as narrow, because its diameter is smaller than that of the main tunnel. But only after realizing the issue with the tubings did I truly picture the sorting tunnel in my head, and it made cold sweat run down my back. It wasn't that the sorting tunnel was narrow with its standard 6-meter width, it's that the ring tunnel is wide. In the Snezhinsk Metro, only 2 tunnels are typical for Soviet subway construction: the sorting and the dead end. But maybe you will say the Snezhinsk Metro was planned from the start as experimental, with a larger diameter, more throughput capacity, and the tubing sealed into the concrete lining. Bullshit. Then why don't all the tunnels have this experimental diameter? What the hell kind of increased throughput are we talking about if the track gauge is the same? What, the subway cars are going to be fatter? And about the ceiling, let me just say one thing. The ring tunnel is made entirely of metal. Yes, when I knocked off the plaster with my belt buckle, I found it. After that, I scraped nearly 100 meters of wall, and everywhere I saw the same yellowish gray metal, like brass. Not a single crack, not a single joint, not even one for thermal expansion. Just the same thing everywhere. And now, I'll try to briefly lay out my hypothesis. Take it however you like. Make your own if you want. Pretty much all the facts are at your disposal now. But first, just hear me out. Here's my core thesis. The ring existed long before the city was founded. It gets easier from here. Let's start with aliens. Although you can substitute in whoever you want. Ancient Atlanteans, the Seven Sages, Celtic Druids, the Freemasons, hell, any bunch you like. The value of the theory stays about the same. So, once upon a time, some beings with access to pretty advanced tech built large tunnels for unclear purposes deep in the Ural Mountains. Or maybe back then it wasn't deep at all. And maybe they weren't tunnels, but something like a pipeline system. Anyway, they built it and then either forgot about it or never ended up needing it. Years, centuries, maybe even millennia passed, and all that stuff was, of course, forgotten as waves of migration rolled over the southern Urals. Huns, Avars, Turks, until eventually a Bashkir group settled here, pushing north some of the Ugric peoples. Now, the Bashkirs didn't do much mining, but their predecessors did. So I dare say that it was this very same wide-eyed chud who first discovered the ring while digging around in the earth. Naturally, such a find would have blown their minds, and as with many early peoples, it would have become either a holy object or the complete opposite. Given their mining-centric worldview, the thing in the ground was probably sacred. That's likely what happened. And after the Ugrics were driven out by the Bashkirs, the cult, shrouded in myth, likely lived on for a time, marking the place as taboo. Don't go there for the Bashkirs. Though maybe the taboo stuck because cultists defended it with weapons for years, killing any outsiders who got close. Either way, thanks to lack of information, the ban eventually became just a household belief, and the southern shore of Lake Sonara remained uninhabited for centuries. Sure, from time to time, a brave Bashkir hunter or a reckless Russian prospector would wander in. And maybe at some point, one of them made it deep into the caves and tunnels beneath what's now the surgical wing. Maybe he lost his mind, or maybe his nerves were tougher than our pampered modern ones. But rumors of the ring started circulating. Eventually, in Soviet times, word got to Lavrenti Pavlovich Beria. To be honest, I have to tip my hat to the man. It took serious balls for the chairman of the special committee to detour several dozen kilometers from his main trip just to see the underground with his own eyes. I do wonder, though, how many of the people who went with him lived to see 1953. I'm sure Beria immediately grasped the uniqueness of the find. This, it existed only in the USSR. This, maybe not immediately, maybe not directly, but it promised a scientific and technological breakthrough, and therefore inevitably led to strengthening the power of the world's first socialist state. The only issue was making sure no one else ever found out about it. Maybe at the time, the potential uses of the ring seemed dazzling, on par with the rapidly advancing nuclear industry, whose secrets the USSR guarded like its own life. So any info related to the ring had to be classified on the same level as the atom bomb. I'd argue Beria treated it as even more secret. How else to explain the devilishly clever plan of building another Atomgrad right above the ring, so they could quietly study in peace? You know what a legend is? Not the mythological kind, the intelligence kind. Like, say, a medium-sized paint and varnish factory is built to produce basic enamel for households, but under it is a massive chemical weapons plant, and the workers at the top level might not even know what's underneath. That's a legend, or cover story. So that's what the city that would later be called Snezhinsk became, with its NII-1011, which would evolve into the giant RFNC VNI ITF. It became the cover for a global project to study the ring. Not a single clever American analyst has ever doubted that the secret city Snezhinsk was built for nuclear weapons development. Replace a small lie with a big one, said Goebbels, and people will believe you. I add, bury a global secret under a mountain of other secrets, and no one will ever even guess there's another one down there. Imagine it. For 40 years, the people of Snezhinsk lived and worked inside a gigantic stage set, dutifully and selflessly doing their jobs and patriotic duty. And the set was functional. Weapons kept improving, bombs kept exploding at test sites, new babies were born in maternity wards, old citizens were buried at cemeteries, and no one suspected this whole play was being staged for a very specific, quite real purpose. I get it. It's hard, and honestly pretty insulting to think that way. A lot of people will find it outright offensive. So I'll ask them, didn't you find it offensive when you had to lie to your relatives and friends on the mainland about what you did? Didn't it sting when you made up excuses about why your parents couldn't come visit you? Didn't it feel off when, thanks to you, your own kids learned to lie to strangers about where they lived from an early age? Even if it was for some noble goal, it was still a lie. No, you weren't offended, because the state was lying right there with you. And when the state decided that you were the unnecessary one in that relationship, for the greater good, for some higher necessity, how could you doubt it? Then you felt offended. But truth is never offensive. Now let's get back to the Metro. Picture this. The 1950s, Stalin and Beria are gone. Power struggles are raging. Snezhinsk is being built full speed. The first bombs are rolling out. All's well. The play goes on. But behind the curtain, things aren't so great. Those in the know ran into a problem, one we won't get into right now. A problem that shattered all expectations. In short, the project failed completely and utterly. So what would you do in their shoes? Declassify it? Hell no. Not a chance. I'm sure every single related document had, and still has, an indefinite top secret stamp, and even the general secretary couldn't override that. But the project still had a budget, and they had to account for the money somehow. I don't know whose idea it was, but it was pure genius. Judging by how it was implemented, it came from some low-level bureaucrat involved in the project, a pencil pusher who was a pro at creative accounting and closing budgets with leftovers. Think about it. The project could only be declassified if the ring ceased to exist. Since destroying it physically was out of the question, the idea was to destroy it on paper. Just rename it. Sound familiar? In bureaucrat speak, to classify Object X due to its non-existence. Funds from Object X to be reallocated to the construction of the GP Lominsky Metro. And that's it. Simple, brilliant. One signature, and the strange ring vanishes, replaced by a much-needed subway, and the metro was built. Under the same strict secrecy, because until it was finished, the regime Object X still existed. And if you think about how much money was sunk into it, you get an idea of just how big their hopes were, in rubles, for the project. You're asking, how do a giant badger and a hidden tunnel fit into my theory? Easily. I assume the main task of the metro's builders was to make maximum use of the ring's existing spaces. Given that I saw a 9-meter wide tubingless tunnel in the badger's den, and there were mine carts with rubble, and I remember no endless convoys of dump trucks hauling soil through the city during my childhood, it all led me to one conclusion. The 6 stations were built where radial tunnels branched off from the ring toward the center, which I estimate lies under the Solmechnyi store, and these radial tunnels were used to haul soil inward, not out. After digging out the station chambers, the radial tunnels were sealed, and the leftover rubble was dumped in the center. As for the badger, I figured that at some point, a few families of those critters got in there, and with no predators around, they grew in size over generations, turned pale, maybe went blind. Slowly evolving, adapting to the environment. That's my theory. I came up with it at the start of December. Everything I knew fit neatly into it. For example, it made perfect sense that since the ring existed independently of the city and was never originally intended for use as a metro, That's precisely why the existing subway didn't touch part of the old neighborhoods, and why the crucial tunnel toward the 9th had to be built using standard metro story methods. For me, the mystery of Snezhinsk no longer existed. Only the mystery of the ring's origin remained, and I believe that sooner or later, I'd manage to uncover it. Back then, it still hadn't occurred to me that I had failed to answer the main question. Why was the construction of the metro never completed? And I had no idea that the answer to that question would force me to reconsider everything I had built in my mind so far. I didn't go back into the underground until the overall picture, as I thought at the time, finally became clear to me. Only then did I begin to think about a new expedition. To be honest, the memory of the badger still made me wake up at night, but that was just the trauma surfacing. In the waking world, I'd almost stopped fearing that creature, having convinced myself that fire, the weapon I'd found, was a reliable defense against the unwanted attention of cunning subterranean beings. Besides, I'd borrowed a gas pistol from a businessman I knew, although I was counting more on the noise of the shot than the tear gas effect. My plan, in short, was this: enter the radial tunnel through the Badger's Passage, reach what I assumed was the central chamber, confirm the presence of the other 5 radial tunnels, and, if possible, explore the central section. I imagined it as a large cavity where all 6 tunnels converged, filled with artificial mounds of displaced soil, riddled from top to bottom with massive badger burrows. What I didn't know was that this expedition would become my last. On December 5th, nearly a month after my encounter with the badger, I re-entered the underground. I reached the mysterious bench without incident, not seeing a single unfamiliar footprint along the way, though on the station itself, there were plenty. For a while, I lay on my stomach, shining my flashlight ahead into the black tunnel beyond the opening. I didn't see any movement there, but still, I had the strong urge to fire a few rounds into the darkness. It took real effort to suppress that reckless impulse. I pushed a bundle of improvised torches through the opening, 5-meter-long sticks wrapped in diesel-soaked rags, then carefully lit the last remaining torch. It flared up with a smoky yellow flame. I waved it inside the tunnel menacingly. Nothing reacted. So, groaning slightly, I began squeezing myself through the narrow gap. But this wasn't the familiar ring I knew like the back of my hand. This was something else, something unknown, and a chill of unease crept over me as glossy yellow-gray arches opened above my head. The firelight flickered and danced across the mirrored surfaces of unpainted metal walls, so that's what made this tunnel different from the rest of the ring. Still clutching the torch, I rose from all fours and picked up the torch bundle from the floor, hooking it onto the clip I sewn to the collar of my jacket. I paused a moment to steel myself, then slowly moved forward between 2 rows of mining carts. A flashlight hung from my chest. In my right hand was the pistol, in my left, the torch. The flame kept blinding me, so I kept pulling it slightly back over my shoulder. After about 50 meters, the mining carts faded into the dark behind me, and with them, the sense of security I hadn't realized I was clinging to. I continued walking between 2 narrow-gauge rails, peering ahead and counting my steps. Something felt off, really off, but I couldn't say what exactly. 10 minutes later, a dark blot appeared ahead, growing denser and blacker as the tunnel walls around it began to take clearer shape in the beam of my flashlight. I realized I was nearing an exit, beyond which lay a darkness no flashlight could pierce. The tunnel ended. Before me opened a colossal hall, too massive to measure, more something you felt than saw. The floor was on the same level as the tunnel, but the ceiling rose high into a dome that stretched forward and up. I swept the light around and saw the wall extend to the right and left, made of that same yellow-gray metal, or was it an alloy? It looked like my assumptions had been correct. The radial tunnel had led me to the central chamber. Judging by the distance I'd covered from Kurchatovskaya, the space couldn't be more than 200 meters across, just as I had imagined. But one thing didn't fit the picture at all. There were no mounds of excavated soil anywhere, not even close. The floor was covered in something I first mistook for decades worth of dust. But after taking a few cautious steps into the chamber, where the floor seemed to slope gently toward the center, I realized this wasn't dust as we normally think of it. The grayish substance beneath my feet didn't rise into the air when disturbed. It flowed like water, closing around my ankles without leaving footprints. Its density was like ash, weightless, fluid, strange, and unsettling. It took real effort to force myself toward the center of the chamber, swallowed up in darkness. Instinctively, I wanted to stick to the wall, so that if something attacked, I could press my back against it and have a fighting chance. So I decided to head left instead, just like I'd planned, to confirm the existence of the other radial tunnels. Switching the torch to my right hand and the pistol to my left, I began walking slowly along the wall, constantly glancing back and listening for any sound. After about 10 steps, I noticed the wall curving inward, and 100 meters later, a tunnel mouth opened to the left, probably the one leading toward Kurchatovskaya. Another 100 meters, and I found yet another tunnel just like it. My theory was proving correct. 100 meters between each exit, 6 exits total, meant the circumference of the central chamber was about 600 meters, 2 pi r. That meant the radius had to be under 100. 100 meters, 15 seconds there, 15 back. I clung to these numbers to convince myself to let go of the wall and step into the pitch black heart of the room. But other numbers crept into my mind. I began estimating the volume of earth removed to build the metro stations, imagining it all dumped here in this cavern. By that math, even if the center was filled to the ceiling with debris, there still should have been plenty piled up around the edges, right where I stood. But there was nothing. Could it be the soil was taken somewhere else after all? No, it had to be here. The carts made that clear. Some were still loaded. Then maybe at the center of the chamber, there was a vertical shaft, and all the removed earth had been dumped down it? My torch burned out, but I didn't light a new one. It was time. Tapping the ground ahead with the charred stick, I started walking. The floor began sloping downward, at first so steeply I stumbled and almost fell, then more gradually. After 10 meters, I was knee-deep in that same grayish sludge. It didn't slow me down much, but it gnawed at my nerves. There was something about it, something too alive, like a creature lying in wait to swallow anyone who dared wander in alone. It was in my head, yes, but the fear was real. Soon, up ahead, I saw a vertical shape begin to emerge, faintly glinting in the beam of my flashlight. As I got closer, I realized it was a column rising up to the ceiling, mounted on a massive circular base about 5 meters wide. Its surface barely rose above the gray sludge, which now reached nearly to my waist. I stepped up to the base and tapped it with the stick. Nothing happened. I tilted the flashlight upward. At about the height of a 5-story building, I saw the ceiling arch above. The column seemed to touch the dome, and if there was any gap between them, it was barely perceptible. I laid the pistol and the spent torch on the base, braced my hands on the cold metal, and tried to climb up. That's when I heard it. A sound coming from this thing, this massive shape I had assumed was just dead metal. And then I saw the light. No, first about 2 meters above the base, a bluish-white dot blinked to life. It flickered for a few seconds, fading in and out. And then from that point, something began to extend outward. Not a beam, not exactly. It grew slowly like a radio antenna, but it was light, a blue electric light. It scattered the darkness around it just faintly, remaining thin as a wire. Its tip drifted sideways toward the distant, unseen wall of the chamber. A minute passed, the beam kept hovering. Then suddenly the sound changed, and the beam started gliding downward along the column, unfolding into a plane. Hypnotized, I watched as a hazy screen bloomed into being, swirling with glowing blue mist like a movie playing on a broken reel. Less than a minute later, the beam reached the floor, and to my right, a glowing 2-meter-wide pathway extended from the column into the darkness. Then, with another tonal shift, I realized the plane of light was beginning to rotate around the column, forming a luminous segment of space that grew and curved toward me with each passing moment. And then, everything exploded into motion, like a film suddenly set to fast forward. Something burst from the glowing void, growling, wheezing, a snarling blur that slammed into the ash, sprang back up, and vanished into the shadows with a throaty screech. It made a wide circle around the column and reappeared, freezing in the beam of my flashlight, glaring at me with wild, bulging eyes. And something dropped inside me, because it wasn't the badger. It was a monster. It looked like an enormous fur-covered toad, its throat pulsing, with curved, saber-like fangs jutting from its maw. Every thought of fire, of the pistol, vanished. There was something ancient and savage in that thing, something that screamed nothing could stop it. It pounced. I ducked, almost diving headfirst into the gray sludge. The creature slammed onto the base and tumbled behind me. I bolted left, trying to put the column between us, but it leapt again, and for one horrible moment I felt its foul, burning breath on my back. I lunged forward, but now a glowing wall of light blocked my way. I had no choice. I dropped to all fours and crawled underneath it. The idea of stepping through it was madness. Gagging on the powder that filled my mouth and nose, I scrambled to my feet and looked back. And through the translucent veil now unfolded across a quarter of the room and still growing toward me, I saw the beast crouch low and weep, straight at me, straight through the shining fog. And just as it sprang, something soft and shimmering reached out of the air and touched my forehead. I came to lying at the base of the column. It was quiet. I clearly remembered what had happened to me right up to the moment the beast leapt at me. And I clearly remembered what I saw after. The first familiar person I ran into that morning on my way back home was a neighbor from across the hall. I greeted her, but she gave me a strange look and walked past. As I opened my door, I sensed that she'd stopped on the landing between floors, and when I turned around, I caught her tense, uneasy stare. She hurried down the stairs. That should have tipped me off, warned me somehow, but I brushed off the moment and paid it no mind, which is why I was completely unprepared for what I saw in the bathroom mirror after stripping off my filthy clothes. A face I didn't recognize. You can't make sense of a shock like that. You have to live through it. I had enough sense not to keep staring at my reflection. I told myself I was just unimaginably tired, filthy, and that all I needed was a good wash, a shave, and some rest. And then the mirror would show my own familiar features again. I just needed a bit of time to recover. My journeys underground had taught me to accept whatever happened to me without question. So I stood there in the shower, snorting under the water and scrubbing myself raw with a washcloth, calm and mentally prepared for anything. The face in the mirror was mine, but older, about 15 years older. I remember the confusion on your faces when I told you I was born in '61. You wanted to ask something, but decided to hold off. A quick mental calculation gave you 37, but your eyes didn't buy it. You figured I couldn't be younger than 50. I really am 37. I can show you the documents, though I know that proves nothing. No, I'm not sick. Not with AIDS or cancer, like some of my acquaintances have been whispering behind my back, already preparing to pity and mourn my untimely death. I don't use drugs either, despite what the rumors say. Honestly, all the gossip kind of amuses me. And no, I didn't go through some traumatic shock that turned my hair white overnight. Look, I've still got plenty of black hairs. I just aged. It wasn't just my face that changed. I genuinely feel 50. My joints ache, my heart twinges, my liver nags me in the mornings. I get winded just walking up to my 3rd floor. Last week I went to the eye doctor, got tested, and immediately ordered glasses. 2 days ago, for the first time in my life, I wore them. Good glasses. Comfortable. If you feel like pitying me or offering condolences, don't waste your breath. I don't feel like a victim. This is life. And like I said, life should be taken as it is. After the eye doctor, I dropped by a psychiatrist and had a little chat. Turns out I'm mentally healthy. I asked if I could get that in writing. He grabbed his pen and asked what organization I needed the certificate for. I could have made something up, but I said I needed it for myself. That's when the mood shifted. He gave me a weird look and asked, "Is something bothering you?" I said, "But you just said I'm mentally healthy without asking me that." He put the pen down and told me my request was unusual. Those kinds of notes are usually given only if a third party requests them. So basically, I said, just asking for a certificate makes me sound unstable. Fine, I'll get a request form. But once I have your certificate, I'll tell you there's a giant underground world beneath Snezhinsk crawling with monsters. Will that change your diagnosis? He looked at me strangely, and I realized I'd pushed too far, so I got up to leave. As I walked out, I noticed he was staring at the cover of my medical file, like he was trying to remember my last name. Or maybe the year I was born caught his eye. Still, I doubt the rumor about me being nuts started with him. Medical confidentiality is still a thing. I probably started it myself, let a few things slip in the wrong places. Funny thing is, when I was a kid, nobody knew about my underground adventures. Not one person. Not even my closest friends. Not a single girl, even though I remember the temptation to impress someone with it was insane sometimes. But even as a kid, I kept my secret intact. And now? Now my natural self-control is slipping more and more often. Maybe my nerves really are shot. Still, it's a fact. People whisper behind my back, dissecting my every move. And if it weren't for those whispers, you wouldn't even know I existed. Or anything else, for that matter. But there's something worse. I've started to feel a certain attention, focused attention, and I think I know where it's coming from. The first warning sign was when all my underground photos vanished from the apartment. And there were a lot, at least 100, maybe more. When I realized what had happened, I found that not just the photos were gone, but some of the underground maps too, the ones I used to navigate. Though, to be honest, that last bit doesn't matter to me much. I'm being followed, plain and simple. Basic tailing. Don't be so quick to write it off as paranoia, if only because it doesn't bother me. Like I said, I'm not afraid of anything. Want proof? Look out the window. Nice pun for your newspaper, huh? See that guy walking on Teorium Boulevard in this 30 below blizzard? He's no random nut job. That's his job. Screw all of that. I want to sum some things up. Pride was my downfall. I convinced myself I had figured it all out. Any facts that didn't fit my theory, I dismissed as insignificant. But how could I not see that mere hollow tunnels under the city wouldn't have caught Barry's attention. I should have understood. There had to be something more. There's no way a man like him wouldn't be intrigued by stories of monsters appearing from nowhere. With his usual cunning, he must have seen it for what it truly was, evidence of a doorway to another world, and the possibilities that came with it. That was the true foundation of the super-secret project. But knowledge never comes free. The project didn't collapse due to hopelessness as I'd first believed. It collapsed because of a catastrophe, one whose full scope we can only guess. The door came with a lock. The spatial shifts in the ring were accompanied by temporal ones, and those shifts weren't confined to the ring alone. I should have realized it sooner without having to test it on myself through accelerated aging. Why the hell did I so casually dismiss the warnings about settling here, brushing them off as natural taboos tied to superstition? Only now do I understand living here was genuinely deadly. The column was active, and what I call temporal radiation affected even the surface, where lifespans were far shorter than at a safe distance from the cursed place. That's the Sinar phenomenon. Now the pieces finally fall into place, like that Bashkir legend recorded near Kishtim. It's just like those old myths where a single day in a cursed realm turns out to be years in the real world. Except here, it's reversed. The arrogant warrior Sagandike strays from his group while hunting in a forbidden zone and returns to the campfire a feeble old man, unrecognizable to his companions. I am the living embodiment of that tale. Forgive me, those of you who began sealing the column. I now know it happened not after construction began, but before the metro idea had even been conceived. And it wasn't about waste removal. It was a desperate struggle for survival. At some point, a disaster struck. A disaster that made it clear just how dangerous the heart of the ring was. And the researchers, those studying the gate to another world, did what they could to isolate the city from that mysterious radiation that caused aging and death. Think of Chernobyl. Think of the sarcophagus over Reactor 4. Think of how many lives and how much health were sacrificed to build it. Say a kind word for those people. The same kind of heroism happened here in Snezhinsk. A sacrifice equal to what the Chernobyl liquidators made, or those who responded to the Mayak disaster. A sacrifice that may never be known. No one will ever know how many. Scientists, engineers, workers, aged and died right in front of their colleagues, absorbing deadly doses of time in mere minutes near the column, doing what had to be done. Once again, please forgive me. Forgive me for my thoughts, for being unfair to you, even in my assumptions. Perhaps at first the radiation was fully blocked by thousands of tons of earth, and tests showed everything was clean. And maybe that's when some idiot, had the insane idea to build that cursed metro. No one stopped to think, what if the column kept operating beneath the sarcophagus? Lord, grant us wisdom. Show us the way. Let the day come when we stop building kindergartens near reactors, putting schools on radioactive burial grounds, opening spas next to poisoned rivers. May we finally understand that we live on Earth for something greater than our fleeting greed and vanity. And if we haven't learned that yet, maybe it's better our hands wither than build more madness. When I came to, lying at the base of the column, I found nothing where the gun and torch had been, just a handful of powder. That slick, gray dust. Yes, the sarcophagus over the column didn't work. Hour after hour, day after day, kept destroying, grinding, evaporating the soil dumped on it, maybe even feeding on it. The column kept operating, and one day, all hope collapsed. The radiation burst out again. The gamble failed, but thanks for trying. Construction stopped. Access to the underworld was sealed, and the city was abandoned to its fate. Again and again I asked myself, why? I don't believe the powers that be were too stupid to realize how dangerous the ring was, and I don't believe there weren't enough resources to evacuate the city and rebuild it elsewhere, nor do I believe there wasn't enough time. Decades had passed. No, the only thing they lacked was basic decency. A city where thousands lived, worked, and loved was left to die. Of course, it wasn't like a neutron bomb, vaporizing everyone instantly. Near the column, yes, people aged and died in minutes. But up here, death was slower. Life just shortened. And who in our God-forsaken country would care about a rise in early death? The locals? Anyone who asked questions was quickly silenced with vague references to classified work and the specific production, while someone nodded toward the fish-shaped bomb casings. We're not assembling toasters here. Even the scenery reeked of death. But the more I dwell on this, the more one horrifying thought haunts me. The city wasn't abandoned. It was left behind, deliberately, logically. The project wasn't shut down. Research continued. It still continues. Someone is publishing papers. Some are defending their theses. Some are receiving state awards, classified ones. 4. Studying tau radiation's effect on the human body and the possibility of hereditary transmission of first-generation mutations. It's a limitless field of study. 50,000 people. Power is as repulsive as a barber's hands. I can see the question on your faces. What do we do? Run? Hide? Try to seal the column again? Blow it up? Who can we count on? I'll answer that last question shortly. As for the rest, you can't just bury a problem or turn away from it. You have to solve it. And that means, one way or another, the city must stop being a hostage. Not to the ring, like you're thinking, but to secrecy. And not just the formal, external secrecy we've all grown tired of. The deeper secrecy buried in our hearts. The one we call lies. It has snowed over our city, covered it in a weightless but suffocating veil. A shroud that keeps us from seeing clearly, from judging our actions for what they are. That, I believe, is the real reason behind all our troubles. Uncle Koya used to say, a person must always know what they're doing, really understand it. Yes, the column brings death. It creates monsters, but I believe those are just side effects. Doesn't it seem likely then that whoever chose to hide them from the world only blocked our path to understanding the core phenomenon and doomed us to suffer the consequences? And maybe, just maybe, by getting used to living in half-truths or outright lies, we help them do it. The column isn't evil. It's just a machine, like a nuclear reactor. You don't walk up and hug it, but it's not evil. We just need to understand how to use it. And one more thing, behind every mechanism, there's intelligence. Remember, when I came to, I found only dust. The torch and the gun, gone. But I wasn't dust. That gives me hope. Hope that my last journey into the underground won't be my last for any of us. I remember clearly what I saw after the monster leapt back into the blue mist, which is why I think I can answer your final question. I know who can help us. I'll tell you how to find them. First, go out into the streets of Snezhinsk. Walk down its snowy roads. Breathe in its clean, frosty air. Look around. Smile at the girls passing by. Help an old lady with her bag. Help a kid cross the street. Then, unhurried, make your way to Yubileni. Climb down into the left of the 2 manholes on its eastern slope. Walk, crawl, squeeze your way to the plain metal door. Step into a short corridor. Slip through a narrow opening. Descend 200 steps. Wave to Kurchatov. Jump off the platform onto the tracks. Walk along the sleepers for 1.5 kilometers. Climb up to the Robochia platform. Crawl under the 3rd bench from the left. Past the long row of carts. Step into the drifting dust of the Great Hall. Approach the column. Wait, be patient. And when the blue mist appears, don't think. Don't hesitate. Step into its glowing depths. And in that very moment, you will feel strong, steady hands pulling you forward. You open your eyes and see young, smiling, bright-eyed people, just like those on the mosaics of the Snezhinsk Metro. Then look closer, and you realize these are the very same people who walk our streets, fill our plazas and boulevards. They are our friends, our family, our neighbors. Only now, their eyes hold no sorrow, no weariness, no despair, no hate, no resignation. All of it gone. Like dirty snow and sunlight, like black ice cracked by spring water, like a mask torn off by the wind. And what remains is a blinding blue glow, the soul of Snezhinsk, forever young. A light that merges strength and kindness, joy and spirit. And in that moment, warm and overwhelming, you will finally understand it is them, the people of Snezhinsk, our fellow citizens, our neighbors, our brothers. It is they, only they, just them and no one else, who can help us. In every trouble, in every sorrow, in every hardship, only they can help us. Help us and help themselves.